Here's another encounter. 7 years ago, my husband George was in the hospital over at CMC. And on a beautiful April day, our 3 adult children and I were sitting there having a very pleasant, quiet visit, right in the middle of which the door to the hospital room came flying open, banged against the wall, and in ran this nurse at top speed. She came to a screeching halt, looked at George, and said, "George Austin, I knew it. I knew it had to be you. I was walking down the hall with a tray full of meds, and I saw that little sign beside the door, and I looked at the sign, and the sign said George Austin, and I looked at that sign that said George Austin, and I thought, I bet that's my George Austin, and here you are." George looked up at her, and he said, "Nicole." She said, "That's right." George said, "I thought you worked at American Dry Cleaners." Nicole said, "Well, I did until several years ago." She said, "I've been to nurses' school, and I am going to be your head nurse." And then she looked at Billy and Beth and Joe and me, and Nicole said, "It was always so fabulous when George would come into American Dry Cleaners on Saturdays with his grass-stained khakis and the shirts and suits that he always seemed to have knocked all the buttons off of." Well, you know that happens when you're 6 feet 7 inches tall. And people used to drive George nuts by saying to him, "My goodness, how tall are you?" So George came up with his own unique answer, which I think, all of us are unique. Come up with your own unique stuff. George would say, "I am 5 feet 19 inches tall." You'd be totally amazed at how many men would then look at him and say, "Oh, come on." They would say, "I've got a brother-in-law that's 6'3", and you're a whole lot taller than he is." Hey, I guess that's another thing you can learn from that particular story. Listening will get you into a lot of hearts and into a lot of places and into a lot of pocketbooks for the donations and the funding that you will continue to need as we beat this always thought of, but no longer, killer, particularly of women. I mean, I know about being tall. People used to say to me all the time. In fact, somebody said to me one time, "Emory, the next time somebody looks at you and says, 'How's the weather up there?' why don't you spit on their head and tell them it's raining?" So Nicole said, George would always had time when he came into American Dry Cleaners to put his arm around us, to sing us a song, to tell us a story, to give us a hug. And after he did that, he would go busting right through those black rubbery things that kind of look like a car wash or the turnstile in the airport, and he would look for Stella, and he would find Stella. 4 feet 8 inches tall, 86 years old, only one living relative, a son in his 60s, no source of income other than ironing clothes at American Dry Cleaners, and he would bring her out in front of everybody, put his arm around her, and sing "Stella" by Starlight. And that little woman's feet would not touch the floor as she floated through the rest of the day. Nicole said when Stella died, the son asked George to sing at the funeral, which he did. Amazing Grace and the Lord's Prayer. We do what we're supposed to do, don't we? When people ask us to do something, we do it. We have learned that that is the best way to climb a mountain and to get through life and to make a difference. But every once in a while, you get an impulse. And sometimes that impulse comes from the deepest spiritual part of yourself, and you've only got a few seconds to decide whether to obey it or not. I want to suggest to you that you pay attention to those impulses and get rid of the "what will people think" situation and do something if it might make a difference for somebody else. So in that moment, when the two preachers sitting up there on the platform aren't quite sure who's supposed to get up next, George just stood back up, walked down, put his hand on Stella's casket, and said, "Okay, Stella, one more time." And he sang "Stella" by Starlight at First Baptist Church in Charlotte, and everybody agreed that that was the single most meaningful moment of the entire service. Your crystal, your lights, your impulses, all a part of who we are. And one of the things that breast cancer has taught me is I am freer to obey those impulses. I am freer to do things just for myself. I am freer to see what I might be able to become when I look in the mirror. But there's a lot more to it than that, because life is not only full of mirrors, it's full of windows. And sometimes we need to wipe the dust off the windows and take a clear look at who we are and what we can contribute. I don't have time to go into all of it tonight, but let me just ask you if you remember how you felt when you were a teenager. Most of us were completely miserable, particularly the girls. I had a nightmare situation growing up because my parents were 40 years old when I was born. I was this height when I was in the 7th grade. I had no shape whatsoever all the way through high school in the year that Mattel invented the Barbie doll. I mean, it was everything that happened to me was a slap in the face. My parents would not leave me alone. They were always at the school. My mother was always a great mother. My parents were always the chaperones. They would not leave me alone and let me grow up. We did not have a television set. We had to sit around the same table every night and look at each other. And I hated it. All my friends had young parents. Let me just explain one of the embarrassing things. When my mother was a great mother and she would bring stuff to school, she would bring homemade cookies, and I would long for the day when my friends' parents would show up with Oreos. And I was so jealous and so envious. How did you grow up, and how did you feel about what you were, and how did you see your future? And then stand on your mountain where you are today and look back. If you are like me, you would not change a thing. I obviously grew up in a blessed place. So were these children sitting right here, growing up in a blessed place. And they may not see it when they're teenagers, but you are an adult for far longer, and you look back and you think, of course. How fabulous to have had older parents who got it. How wonderful to have a name, Emory. If you cannot remember my full name, but you can remember Emory, and you Google it, you're either going to get me, a freight line, a university, or a company that sells those things you grind your fingernails off with. We all come from interesting, unique individual places, and the way that we handle health issues, the way we handle what could be the best thing North Carolina and the South has going for it right here in this city is going to depend a lot on how you view yourself. I want to ask you something else, because all of us also grew up. Let me just stop right now and say, if you did not grow up in a blessed place, you also, by the very same token, grew up in a place where you can make decisions that are different from that and take a different path and contribute instead of being done to. All of that is possible for every one of us because we have great and phenomenal choices living where we do in the age in which we live. So pay very close attention to all that. Now, probably all of you grew up hearing lines at your house that didn't make any sense to you. I mean, all of us did. I don't know where these things come from. Here's an example. If you keep making that face, your face will... Is this something that is treated a lot here in this hospital? I collect those lines from the past because I think it's fascinating what people grew up hearing. I mean, did you hear things like, clean your plate, there are children starving somewhere? I've got a T-shirt that says, drink your coffee, there are people asleep in India. How many of you, I'm sure in the medical profession, this is a good place for me to do research here, because I grew up hearing that you would never, ever, ever supposed to leave home in dirty underwear, or and I had this picture of the emergency room with all of the people lined up, because there was always this prediction that there was going to be an automobile accident. And I knew that the medical staff was looking at each other and saying, okay, you know what we got to check first?